Professor Noam Chomsky has been a subject of great acclaim during his lengthy career. Once referred to by Paul Robinson of the New York Times Book Review as possibly our greatest intellectual alive, Mr. Chomsky is best known for his contributions as a linguist, writer, and political activist. As the author of over 100 books and countless columns and essays, Mr. Chomsky's writings have focused largely on the politics of power and what we as individuals can do to bring about social change. On March 8, 2013, Think Global School had the opportunity to have a question-and-answer session with Professor Chomsky, where he fielded questions pertaining to his perspectives on war, politics, and mass media.
One of our students at CGS is in London, and she's on Skype right now. Is it possible for me
Skype.
to turn her around? Or
Just say hello, or she has a question.
She wants to listen in the conversation.
She wants to listen in? Oh, sure.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just turn her around. Another friendly face.
Okay, that was an easy one.
No, that was okay.
Yeah.
My name is Anat. I'm from Palestine. And when you went to Gaza, after you went to Gaza, you wrote an article about your visit to Gaza. And in the article you wrote on how in 2006, when Hamas was elected to be the government of Gaza, you
The government of Palestine.
Yeah. You wrote about how Israel did not like it, and they started the intensive attacks since from 2006, and then followed by the war, correct? So do you think that since now the Morsi is elected in Egypt, and he's part of the Muslim Brotherhood, so do you think America will respond the same way that Israel did for Hamas, or do you think...
To Morsi?
Sorry?
To the Morsi government?
Yeah.
No, in fact, the U.S. is pretty favorable to the Morsi government. What you said about Hamas is exactly right, and it's very important. The first free election in the Arab world, actually, in many ways the only free election, took place in Palestine in January 2006. It was monitored, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair, but it had a defect, came out the wrong way. What the U.S. wanted didn't happen. So instantly, the United States and Israel, followed by the European Union, reacted in the natural way when people vote the wrong way, imposed very harsh sanctions on them, and increased military attacks and so on. There's something else which is not much discussed. The U.S. also initiated standard operating procedure when people do the wrong thing, organize a military coup to overthrow the government. So the U.S. immediately began to organize a military coup together with the Palestinian administration, which the Fatah was with Dahlan, and the idea was the next year there should be a military coup. Well, Hamas preempted the military coup and blocked it. And at that point, the West went berserk. I mean, it's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. It's even worse to block a military coup that the U.S. initiates to overthrow the government. So at that point, the sanctions shot up fast, much harsher sanctions. Military attacks shot up. And the way this is described in the West almost uniformly is that in 2007, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. Well, that's true, but kind of leaves out a little of the background. So that's basically what happened there. In the case of Egypt, it's quite different. First of all, the United States supported the Mubarak dictatorship as long as it was possible. That's standard. There's a standard procedure when one of your favorite dictators is in trouble. It's used over and over again. It takes kind of genius not to perceive it. Somoza in Nicaragua, Duvalier in Haiti, Marcos in the Philippines, Mobutu in the Congo, Suharto in Indonesia, always the same. Support your dictator, your favorite dictator, as long as it's feasible. When it becomes impossible, usually because the army turns against him, so you can't do it anymore, then send the dictator off somewhere. In the case of Haiti, put him in an Air Force plane and send him to Paris with about half the treasure in his pocket. Others do something else. In the case of Mubarak, when you couldn't support him any longer, sent him off to Sharm el-Sheikh to vacation and so on. And then the next step is, first of all, call upon the intellectual community to issue ringing declarations about your love of democracy and how you're totally dedicated to democracy, and then move to restore the old regime as much as you can, various degrees. Depends on the circumstances. That's precisely what was done in Egypt. Mubarak was supported, and also in Tunisia. Tunisia is mostly a French protectorate, so the French were playing the game. They supported the Ben Ali dictatorship even beyond the point when it was possible to do so. In fact, it became a kind of like a bad joke when Tunisia was falling apart and people rioting in the streets. One of the French cabinet ministers went to Tunis for her vacation, but it's basically the same story. In the case of Egypt, it was U.S. initiative. So support Mubarak as long as possible. Obama supported him until the last minute. Army turned against him, sent off to Sharm el-Sheikh, ringing declarations about your love of democracy, and then essentially try to restore the regime. Well, the only way to restore the regime or something like it in the Egyptian case was through the Muslim Brotherhood, that they're pretty accommodating to U.S. wishes. The main concerns of the United States are with the economic regime. Egypt had been subjected to the standard neoliberal programs that are applied everywhere, had the usual effects, a lot of corruption, a lot of economic growth, but very concentrated in few pockets, kind of like the United States, destroying benefits for the general population, impoverishing the population. In fact, a good part of the uprising in Egypt and Tunisia was just rejection of the neoliberal programs. But the U.S. was able to count on Morsi and the Brotherhood to reinstate those programs. It's being negotiated right now with the World Bank and so on. But of all the possible groups in Egypt, they were the ones most likely to restore the traditional order. I mean, if they want to, make women wear scarves or something, the United States doesn't care. That's of no concern. But so they're supporting Morsi, and he's taking on dictatorial powers. As far as Gaza is concerned, it's important to remember that the security system in Egypt, the Mukhabarat, which is a vicious security system in all the Arab world, they weren't touched. The Mukhabarat are still in charge of the Gaza border, and in fact in most of the, maybe all the major Arab countries, what's called the Palestinian dossier, concern for the Palestinians, that's pretty much in the hands of the Mukhabarat. They're regarded as a security problem. The Arab dictators don't like them, so they're under the control of the intelligence services, who can be pretty brutal. They work closely with the CIA and the Israeli Mossad, and Gaza is still pretty much imprisoned. You may have, I'm sure you read just a couple of weeks ago, Morsi started flooding the tunnels with sewage. I mean, even Mubarak didn't do that. The tunnels are one of the few lifelines in the siege. There was an attempt to block them before. It never worked. But flooding them with sewage would probably close them. There was some opening under Morsi, some. So it's a little easier to get in and out. But, for example, I happened to be there in October, and one of the things I did was I was with a group of people. We had a discussion with the head of the hospital in Khan Yunis, big hospital, head of surgery, and he gave a very eloquent description. Well, the hospital's kind of well run, but bare, absolute bare minimum. Good people working hard, but nothing much. They don't have simple surgical equipment. They don't have medicines. Simple things that could be brought in through Egypt, but they're not. In fact, right at that time, this is the time of the last Israeli attack, the UN came out with an analysis of what was available, and it turned out, I don't remember the exact numbers, but about half of the essential medicines, even simple things like for pain and so on, just were unavailable. All of that could come in through Egypt, nothing blocking it. Israel won't let it in, but it's not happening. I mean, there's some things coming in, some things coming in through the tunnels, but it's limited. So the stranglehold is being kept. I suspect part of the reason, from the Egyptian point of view, it would be any Egyptian government, is that they understand what Israel's goal is. Israel's goal, and this goes way back to 1948, is to drive the population out, drive them into Egypt, because Israel doesn't want them there, and said so quite openly in cabinet records. Get them out. Same on the West Bank. And Egypt must understand that, and they don't want it. They don't want the population. The Sinai, the northern Sinai, has a lot of problems for Egypt. It's a very complicated area. Bedouins have their own interests, and there's a lot of smuggling and violence and so on, and they don't want hundreds of thousands of people from Gaza pouring in there. So they have their own reasons for keeping the closure. But something has changed under the pressure of the Arab Spring, but not as much as should have been. And the U.S. is, to get back to your question, the U.S. has no objections to the Morsi government. They're doing pretty much what the U.S. wants, not like Hamas.
Hello, my name is Yada, and I'm from Thailand.
From?
Thailand.
Yeah.
As you know, America is hitting its $16 trillion debt ceiling, and do you think the U.S. will have to severely slow down its drone activity and slash military?
Slow down what?
Do you think that the U.S. will have to slow down drone activity and slash military spending against Al-Qaeda in the future? And how do you think other countries will perceive the U.S. if it slashes its anti-Al-Qaeda efforts?
Well, first of all, the anti-Al-Qaeda effort is mostly propaganda. Al-Qaeda would have totally disappeared if the U.S. wasn't carrying out what they call anti-terrorist activities. The activities that the U.S. carries out is just sponsoring, all kinds of terrorism. And if if you're walking, you live in some village somewhere, and every moment you know that you can't tell when there might be an explosion 2 feet in front of you, which would kill everybody around and destroy everything. And sometimes it happens. How do you feel? Well, okay, that's the kind of thing that creates what the U.S. calls terrorists. Al-Qaeda itself didn't amount to much in the first place, but it was dispersed and it doesn't function. By now it's just a name for anyone the U.S. doesn't like. Sometimes they call themselves Al-Qaeda because there's a kind of symbolic connection, but it has nothing to do with any central authority or anything like that. As far as the military budget is concerned, it's an interesting question. The U.S. spends about as much as the rest of the world combined, approximately as much. It's the only country in the world that has roughly 1,000 military bases around the world. No other. France has a base in Djibouti, one or other countries, but essentially the U.S. is essentially the only country with bases all over. The U.S. is very concerned about Chinese military spending. You may have seen an article in the press a couple days ago warning that China is rapidly increasing its military spending to dangerous levels. I think it was to about the level of what the United States spends in Afghanistan. A small fraction of U.S. military spending. And China's a big country. They've got the security problems all around the borders. The U.S. has no security problems, none, zero. Hasn't for hundreds of years. But the U.S. is very concerned about the Chinese military spending. Okay. And there is a conflict between China and the United States, kind of a military conflict. It's called, if you look at the U.S. strategic analysis literature, It's called a classic security dilemma. The classic security dilemma is when you have two countries, each of which has a kind of an existential need, something that they regard as something they must defend, and the two of them happen to be in conflict. That's a classic security dilemma. The classic security dilemma between the United States and China is in the waters off China's coast. It's not in the Caribbean. It's not in the waters off California's coast. It's in the waters off China's coast. For China, these are important. Those are the trade channels. That's where all the commerce goes to Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. For the United States, it's very important because the U.S. thinks it ought to control all the waters in the world, not have any interference with it. So the U.S. position is called defense of freedom of the seas, not defense of freedom of the seas in the Caribbean. Like if China was sending aircraft carriers to the Caribbean, we'd be dead. It'd be a nuclear war. But if the United States is sending nuclear-armed aircraft carriers not far from the coast of China, which have nuclear missiles which could hit Beijing, well, that's just defending freedom of the seas. And it's a conflict that could blow up. The other countries of the region are also involved. So there's a confrontation right now between Japan and China over some islands, Diaoyu Islands in Chinese, Senkaku in Japan. The islands are kind of off the coast of Taiwan, very, very far from Japan. But remember, Japan was a major imperial power, conquered a lot of Asia, a lot of the Pacific, and a residue of that is it has claims to a wide range of islands in the Pacific. Japan and China have roughly the same coastline, but Japan has far more claims to coastline. I forget the exact numbers, but way above China. That's a reflection of the relative power during the period of imperial expansion where Japan was leading imperial power in the region. And that could blow up into something serious. They're scrambling jet planes and so on. Maybe they'll manage. There's other problems in the South China Sea, the other countries of the region, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. They're uneasy about Chinese expansion. Chinese expansion is not military, but it's commercial and cultural. And there's a history. For thousands of years, not a brief period, China was the center of the world. The rest were barbarians. And the people all around, and what's called the West was just a bunch of guys running around, and hunter-gatherers running around. They weren't part of it, but the region, all those regions were kind of tributary to China. Like Okinawa, for example, it was independent. It wasn't occupied by China, but it was a tributary. They paid allegiance to the court and Peking and so on. And the countries there now just don't like this. They don't want to be tributary to China. I can tell you a personal example that illustrates it very well. In 1970, at the peak of the Vietnam War, bombing all over the place, I visited Hanoi. I was invited to teach at the university, actually the ruins of the Polytechnic University. There was a short bombing pause, so it could get in. And South Vietnam was practically destroyed. North Vietnam was plenty of damage, not total. So I got there, but the war, it was right in the middle of the war, the peak of the war. At first, it's a highly totalitarian state. You do everything's planned. You don't go where you want. You do what they tell you. The first morning I was there, I was with a couple of friends. We were taken to the War Museum to see the War Museum in Hanoi, and we sat through an extremely boring discussion of every conflict since the 11th century, and the conflicts were all with China. And, they were describing in detail how, in the 12th century, Vietnamese sisters organized a resistance and did something to the Chinese, and it went on like this. But what they were telling us was very simple. They said, you guys are destroying us now, but you're going to go away. China's never going to go away. They're sitting right there. And that's our real problem. That's the way, that's the general attitude in the surrounding region, and understandable. And there are conflicts over resources. In the sea there are oil, other resources, and these conflicts could flare up. Sometimes they do, but they're not really military conflicts.
So, do you think that the U.S. will ever stop its anti-terrorism efforts in light of the financial crisis?
Here in the United States?
Yes.
The financial crisis is, it's real, but it's kind of artificial. There are ways out of the financial crisis. The business press knows what they are. Some serious economists know what they are. The crisis right now in the United States, there is a crisis in the United States. It's a neoliberal crisis. Same kind of crisis that you have all over the world. It's in the last 40 years. The so-called neoliberal programs which imposed or are called sound economics have been devastating wherever they've been applied. They always have about the same consequences. They do lead to economic growth. Like in the United States, this is about since 1980, Reagan. There's been economic growth. There's been a growth in productivity. Almost all of it, over 90%, has gone into the pockets of a very small number of very rich people. For the general population, it's stagnation and decline. Now, the United States is not Egypt or sub-Saharan Africa, so it's not as harsh here as it is elsewhere. But structurally, it's about the same. Actually, Europe's doing the same thing right now. That's what a large part of what they revolted again in Egypt. Well, here it continues, and one aspect of this is a huge growth in the financialization of the economy since the 1970s. In the United States, banks used to be banks. They weren't interstate. You got a little extra money, put it in the bank, they lent it to somebody to, start a business or buy a car or whatever it was. That was what a bank was. That was during the big growth period, the 50s and the 60s. Since the 70s, it's quite different. What are called banks are huge firms that are carrying out risky transactions, trying to shave off a microsecond so they can make some money, and grown enormously in scale. By the time that you got to 2007, the latest financial crisis, they literally had about 40% of corporate profits. And now they're bigger and richer than ever. There's a system in the United States which is called deregulation. Deregulation is part of the neoliberal programs that they teach you in economics courses, how wonderful it is. So you deregulate, and of course then you have financial crises, because there were none when the banks were regulated. But there's another aspect to the deregulation. It's a government insurance policy. It's called too big to fail. It's an insurance policy given by the government which tells the big banks, you go ahead, take risky transactions, make a lot of money because they're risky. When it crashes, which it will, and maybe you bring down the whole economy with it, don't worry about it, because we're going to bail you out. Okay, that's the way it works. And this has been happening over and over. And it's happening, we're going on to the next one right now. One of the directors of the Bank of England calls it a doom loop. It's designed that way. And it works. It doesn't work for the population, but it works for the rich and powerful, which is what policy is designed for, not just here, everywhere. And that does lead to financial crises. We're right in the middle of one. But it's an artificial crisis. It can be overcome. Right now, you take a look at the stock market. It's shooting up to the stratosphere. That tells you the stock market doesn't reflect the economy. It reflects corporate profits. and expectations of corporate profits. And they're doing fine. The corporations have money coming out of their pockets. They don't know what to do with it. The banks are bigger and richer than ever. I should incidentally mention that this no big government insurance policy is not small. It's been estimated by economists at maybe $50 billion a year or so. That turns out to be a serious underestimate. There's a recent study a couple of weeks ago came out from the International Monetary Fund, which their calculation is that the effect of the insurance policy covers virtually all the profits of the big banks. They make a lot of profit out of it, and not just the bailout. They get better credit ratings because credit agencies know they're going to bail them out. The investors know they're going to bail them out. They get cheaper credit. They can pay low interest rates. It amounts to a lot of money, and it's estimated roughly their total profits. They're a kind of a parasite on the economy. They don't really contribute anything to it, but they draw from it. And that's the financial crisis. Europe is not that different. Right now, the problem in the country, you can see it in the sequester that's happening right now. Take a look at the sequester. There's one issue in the sequester, the deficit. Okay? We have a problem with the deficit. Actually, the deficit's not much of a problem. In fact, the problem with the deficit is it's too small. Corporations aren't investing. They have a ton of money, but they don't want to spend it because there isn't enough demand. So why should they spend it? Private consumption it's going along, but people are still trying to pay off debts from the last crisis, collapse of the housing market. So they're not buying as much as they could. There's only one possible source of demand. That's the government. One way for the government to increase demand is increase the deficit, which is a good thing to do from an economic point of view, not from the point of view of the banks. They don't like deficits. They don't like deficits because they might ultimately lead to inflation. There isn't a single sign of that. The sign is the opposite. And the markets are saying the opposite. They don't see any sign of inflation. But the banks don't want to have the risk. They don't care about joblessness and people starving and so on. That's not their business. And their power is so enormous that the only issue discussed is the deficit, getting rid of the deficit. Not a big problem. You can read one of the few people who's writing about it sensibly in the mainstream is Paul Krugman, a Nobel laureate in economics, writes for the New York Times. He read his column this morning. He's saying the same thing over and over that he's been saying for a couple of years, that the business press has been saying. Not a particularly radical position. So you need a bigger deficit and you need government stimulus spending because there isn't any other source of demand in the economy. The way the business press puts it, like Business Week, is now is the time to push the accelerator, get the economy moving. Later you can push the brake. I mean, if you ever get into a problem later, there'll be plenty of time to deal with the potential deficit. It's not amount to much. But the banks are so powerful that they run the show, and the sequester is about the deficit. The effect of the outcome of the sequester will be probably to cut back the very weak benefit system, Medicare and Medicaid. Anything that just harms the population is fine. You have to make sure, get rid of food stamps, things like that. But don't deal with huge corporate profits, the huge bonuses going to the guys who just wreck the economy and the big banks. That's sacrosanct. So you don't touch that. Well, that's the way a plutocracy runs. And in the third world, it's much more severe, of course, because they start with much harsher conditions. But it's structurally similar. So there is a financial crisis. It's eliminable by policy. It's not having much of an effect on military spending. I mean, people wail about, cutting back military spending. It's usually restricting the growth of military spending, which is already enormous. Like I said, it's roughly the same as the rest of the world combined, not for security reasons. It's not defending us from anything. The so-called attacks on al-Qaeda, like the drone strikes. This is just a global assassination program, which is probably generating terrorists as fast as or faster than it's killing suspects. And the people it's killing, remember, are suspects. They haven't been shown to be guilty of anything. Actually, there's a big case in New York this morning, which you may have heard about if you listened to the radio or read the papers. There's a great al-Qaeda terrorist being brought to New York to be tried, major event. Who's the al-Qaeda terrorist? Well, he's a guy who he was a propagandist. He talked. He said, he said things in favor of what we call terrorist attacks on us. He did, in fact. I mean, so he's being charged with conspiracy to carry out terror. Well, let's take a look at the United States. I mean, both presidential candidates, both political parties, all of the media, virtually the entire intellectual class is constantly, regularly, every day, calling for threats to bomb Iran. I mean, that's much worse than anything this guy's doing. That's calling for aggression, murderous aggression. So are they being charged for conspiracy to carry out aggression? Why not? It's a lot worse than what this guy's being charged with. But, the powerful set their own framework, and you're supposed to obey it. You're not supposed to think about it. You don't have to, but that's the way it's supposed to work. Educational system is geared that way, media is geared that way, and so on. Not just on this issue, on a great many issues. But if you think about it a little bit, I think you can see that the terror, in addition, I might add that protecting the population against terror is typically of quite a low priority of governments, including the United States. And there are very dramatic illustrations of this right in front of your eyes. So take, say, the invasion of Iraq. It's now the 10th anniversary. When Iraq was invaded, there was all kind of concocted stories about Iraq's relation to terrorism, which were total fabrications. Nobody even pretends anymore. But there was a connection. When Iraq was invaded, the intelligence agencies, British and the United States, French and others, warned that the invasion of Iraq is likely to significantly increase terror for reasons that are pretty obvious. And it did, in fact, well beyond what was anticipated. In the first year after the invasion, according to U.S. government statistics, there was a 7-fold increase in terror, Islamic terror. Huge increase. Not a big surprise. What do you think would happen if the United States was invaded? So, yeah. And it was undertaken with the expectation that it would increase terror, and as it did. But that didn't matter. Protecting the population from terror just isn't that important. Now, there are other dramatic examples of this. So there's the part of the U.S. Treasury. It's called OFAC, Office of Foreign. I forget what it's called, but it's looking into part of the Treasury that looks into probably illegitimate financial transactions around the world, drug money, terrorist funding, things like that. A couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, they released their data on what they'd been doing for the last 20 years, period of supposed concern about Islamic terror. Turns out that the overwhelming part of OFAC, almost all of their activities, were devoted to monitoring attempts to violate the U.S. embargo of Cuba, which is totally illegal. The entire world's against it, but the U.S. insists on imposing it, and that's what OFAC is looking into. Is anybody using some in a hospital equipment, some nickel which was imported from Cuba? If so, we got to impose sanctions on them. What about terrorist financing? Well, minor problem. We don't have time to worry about that. That's the way governments work. Should recognize it. So I think you should be very cautious when you read that the military spending is to combat al-Qaeda. It's not. You could raise the same kind of questions about the whole Cold War.
Thank you.
So I'm David. I'm from the States. I'm taking an economics class, and yesterday we had an economics speaker. Yesterday we had an economics speaker come to talk to us, and I feel like he was very inclined on believing. I feel like he was very inclined on believing that putting any kind of restrictions on trade with other countries is a bad thing for any country, and I thought that in some circumstances it could be beneficial. I just wanted to know what your opinion was on putting restrictions or just free trade or how...
Well, the United States, remember, is strongly opposed to free trade. It always has been all through its history. I mean, economists can talk about what they want, but if you look at the actual policies, they're very strongly opposed to free trade, right now, too. So take what are called the free trade agreements, like the World Trade Organization agreements or NAFTA and so on. There are some elements of liberalization in them, but they're very, very strong protectionist elements, very strong, sharply restrictive of trade. In fact, there's a name for them. They're called TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property Restrictions. What this is extremely harsh patent requirements, much harsher than ever existed in history. If they'd existed in history, the United States would never have developed, or England. Very harsh protectionist elements to preserve the profits of U.S. corporations and other Western corporations, like pharmaceutical corporations. They want to make huge profits, so they don't want drugs to be available to treat poor people starving poor people in India or South Africa. So you got to have very heavy restrictions. That's opposed to free trade, strongly opposed to free trade, but very much in favor of corporate profits. And that's only the beginning. In fact, what's called trade, a large part of it isn't even trade. So take, say, the U.S. and Mexico. That's supposed to be a great triumph of free trade. What happens is, they take a look at U.S.-Mexico trade, so-called. A large part of it, maybe 40 or 50%, amounts to, say, parts being manufactured in Indiana, sent to Mexico for assembly in a maquila, cheap plant where you get very cheap labor, no environmental protection, sent back across the border to be sold as cars in Los Angeles. That's called trade in both directions. I mean, it's very much like, say, under the old Soviet Union. If parts were made in Leningrad and sent to Poland for assembly and sold in Moscow, it crossed borders in both directions, but we never called it trade. There was transactions inside a command economy. And the same thing is true when General Motors does what I just described. So interactions within a command economy. And a good part of trade, corporations don't tell you what they're doing. It's not their business. The government could find out, but it doesn't want to. So there's just estimates, but it's estimated at roughly 40, maybe 50%, which isn't trade at all. A lot of the World Trade Organization rules are called TRIMs, trade-related investment mechanisms. Has absolutely nothing to do with trade if you look at it. Trade is stuck in there so they can put it in the agreement. It's a way to guarantee the rights of U.S. investors in other countries. So if General Motors, say part of NAFTA is that if General Motors invests in Mexico, they have to be treated like a Mexican company. They have to get what's called national treatment. Notice that only works for corporations. Like if a Mexican happens to get to New York and asks for national treatment, you know what'll happen. But for corporations, they have to get national treatment. This has nothing to do with trade. This has to do with guaranteeing the rights of tyrannical organizations, concentrations of power that are basically big tyrannies. And this goes all the way back through history. You just go back to early American history, okay? This is something that economists ought to know, but a lot of them don't know. So just take the United States. which is every other country is about the same. But we'll take the United States. In the 1770s, the United States was gaining independence. Okay, so it was going to be able to run its own economic policies. The colonists got advice from the great economists of the day, from Adam Smith, in fact, who lectured to the colonies on what is now called sound economics, pretty much what the economics profession tells the third world today, and what the World Bank tells the third world today. The lecture was just what you heard. We should have free trade. Don't put up any barriers. That's bad. So you do what you're good at, what was later called your comparative advantage. You, the colony, the U.S., produce primary products, food, fish, fur. You keep to that. And import superior manufactured goods from England, which is more advanced. And everyone will benefit. And then comes a theorem proving, by now it's theorems, then it was just guesses, proving that everyone will benefit. Britain also imposed the same principles on India, but there they did it by force. Okay, they couldn't do it by force in the colonies because they were liberated. India at that time was commercially, industrially probably more advanced than England was. But by imposing these regulations on India, India was deindustrialized, turned into an impoverished agricultural country. That's India. The United States was free, so it simply rejected all the principles of sound economics, all of them. It immediately raised tariffs very high to keep out superior British manufacturers. That enabled the United States to develop its textile industry, which is the way the Industrial Revolution begins. On through the century, that's how the U.S. could develop a steel industry, keeping out superior British steel. Finally, we get to the modern period. Let's take the Second World War, where we are now. By now, the U.S. doesn't want protectionist barriers anymore, except the kind I mentioned. The country that is likely to win in a competition is always in favor of free trade. So in the case of England, by the 1850s, when they were way ahead of the rest of the world in industrialization, thanks to imperial policies and others, then they decided, free trade would be a nice idea because we're going to win. England kept up with that until the 1920s, when Japan was beginning to outcompete them. And at that point, the decision was, look, the heck with free trade, and Britain closed off the empire. India, Singapore, closed off the empire to Japan so that they couldn't trade with it because we have to protect British industry. So as long as we're going to win, let's have free trade, except we put in our own constraints to make sure we do even better. Same with the United States. The United States has been the most protectionist country throughout the 19th and early 20th century, literally the most protectionist. By 1950, the U.S. is kind of like England a century earlier, so far ahead of the rest of the world that if there was something like free trade, the U.S. would easily, U.S. corporations would do better. As I said, there are plenty of constraints to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. But something else happened. At that point, the United States turned to very extensive state intervention in the economy. Like you got a computer over there, which is using the internet. Where'd they come from? They didn't come from free enterprise, entrepreneurial initiative, consumer choice, anything like that. They came from places like MIT. In fact, the lab where I was working in the 1950s, that's where these things were being developed under the government funding, extensive government funding. There were private companies like IBM in there, kind of learning how to shift from punch cards to electronic computers using the government-financed creative work that was being done in places like MIT and government laboratories. And finally, by the early 60s, about 10 years after this, IBM was able to produce its own computers, fast computer, but nobody could buy it. It was way too expensive. So the government bought it for Los Alamos, a government installation. In fact, procurement is a major technique for subsidizing private industry. It's been pretty well studied. And a lot of other devices. Anyway, to make a long story short, same with the Internet. These were about 30 years, mostly in the state system. Finally, around the late 70s, in the case of computers, 1990s, in the case of the Internet, they were handed over to private enterprises for profit. That's how Bill Gates and Steve Jobs become millionaires. You take what's produced in the state sector, where the hard work is done and the risky work, and then you adapt it to the commercial market. Nice-looking things that you can sell, apps and so on. That's true of most of the economy. It's got nothing to do with free trade. This goes way back. Incidentally, England did the same thing. Before us, England had to destroy the more advanced economies outside. Like Ireland, England had to destroy the Irish wool industry. It had to destroy Indian, much more advanced textile industrial production. The Low Countries, Belgium, where now Belgium and the Netherlands, had much more advanced technology, so England stole the technology and, in fact, the technicians. It's now called piracy. And every developed country that followed England has done exactly the same. Just take a look at who are the developed countries around the world. Just take a look at them. England, the United States, Germany, France, Netherlands, Japan, the one country of the South that was not colonized. The countries that were not colonized and therefore could do what the United States and England did, that they developed. Take a look at the rest of the world, the ones that were colonized effectively. There wasn't much of a gap in the 18th century. In fact, as I said, India and China were probably more advanced than the West was. But now that's the third world. And a large part of the reason is that they had sound economics rammed down their throat, because it's very destructive. What works is, it's now happening with China, just as it happened with Japan, or South Korea, or Taiwan, the East Asian tigers. There's hardly, I don't think there's an exception in economic history. So there's a kind of an interesting gap between actual economic history, and economic historians are perfectly well aware of this. They write about it. So there's economic history and there's economic theory, and they're divorced. And it's interesting to look into the divorce and the separation. Adam Smith's advice to the United States is a perfect example. So I again, be cautious about the rhetoric about free trade. Maybe you can prove nice theorems about it, but same ones you could have proven in the 18th century.
Hi, my name is Ahmad Jawed, and I'm from Afghanistan. I have a question about the U.S. policy regarding Afghanistan, and it's about your future military bases that they plan on having in Afghanistan. Well, at least that's what it seems like. So since they have come to Afghanistan, they have had so many troops, and the supplies that they need for the military, most of them come through Pakistan, and they every year give millions of dollars to the Pakistani government in order to have their supplies shipped safely through Pakistan border. And that money obviously goes to Pakistani government and to ISI, which then goes back to Taliban's, and backs them up from the other side of the border.
It's another loop.
Yeah, and so I was thinking, what do you think would this mean for the war in Afghanistan if they build a military base and then they need endless supplies to be shipped through Pakistan for them? Then they still keep giving them money because they need their supplies to arrive safely in Afghanistan. And if they do not do that, that means the Pakistani government will create issues for them in the border, and then they don't want that. So they're giving money to Pakistani government in order to have supplies for their soldiers to fight against terrorism. So do you think having a military base would actually be effective in this case?
Effective for what?
For
what?
For what?
Yeah.
Afghans. For the safety of them, for peace in Afghanistan.
For the benefit of Afghanistan. Policies aren't undertaken for the benefit of the victims.
Mm-hmm.
And they may talk about it, but that's rhetoric. They're taken for the benefit of those who hold the clubs.
So what do you think they want out of this?
What do they want? They want military bases.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the same in Iraq. There were basically two war aims in Iraq. By the end, they were kind of openly stated. One was to maintain permanent military bases in Iraq, which the U.S. could use to dominate the region. It's an important region. That's the main energy reserves of the world. And the second was for U.S. corporations to have privileged access to Iraq's enormous energy resources, maybe second or third largest in the world. But to anybody with eyes open, it was always obvious that was the purpose of the war. And by the end, it was openly stated. I can give you the sources if you like, because you couldn't conceal it any longer. Well, the U.S. didn't get either of them. They ran up against Iraqi nationalism, which they couldn't overcome. And Iraqi nationalism, whatever you think about it, it was strong enough to reject both of these conditions. Now Iraq is a total mess. It was half destroyed by the war. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions of refugees. Iraq had been the most advanced country in the Arab world. It was almost at first world standards. Very high educational system, really medical system. It was a functioning country. That was partially destroyed by the sanctions. The rest of it was destroyed by the invasion. And now it's a total ruin. There's one country that gained in the war, namely Iran. Iran is now much more influential thanks to the invasion. The Shiite government in Iraq is sympathetic to Iran, so Iran was a big victor in the Iraq war. Actually, the other country that's a victor is Assad. Assad's Syria is now being supported by Iraq, so he's also a gainer from the Iraq war. But Iraq itself was practically destroyed, and much of the region was torn to shreds. The Sunni-Shiite conflict, which is tearing the region apart, it's all a result of the invasion. Well, what about Afghanistan? Afghanistan never had the significance for U.S. policy that Iraq did. Iraq's a rich, powerful country. But, after first of all, it's 10 years of war, but it goes way back. In the 1980s, the U.S. was pouring money into Pakistan, not for support of the Mujahideen. And the goal wasn't to liberate Afghanistan. In fact, they said so. The goal was to kill Russians. Said so precisely in those words. The effect was to support Pakistan's worst dictator, Zia-ul-Haq. Plenty of dictators. He was the worst. And to support Saudi Arabian efforts to Islamicize the country. Saudi Arabia is the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist state in the world, close U.S. ally, like it was a British ally, and they're also a missionary state, so they spent a lot of money trying to export their radical ideologies, and that's when you get the madrasa. Are you from Pakistan?
No, from Afghanistan.
From
Afghanistan.
Also, you know the story.
Yeah.
But that's when the madrasas were established and the basis for the Taliban and so on. And the radical Islamization of the country. I mean, now it's almost, for example, destroyed science teaching in Pakistan. It used to be a scientific center. But so that goes back to the 80s, then goes right through the 90s and the last 10 years of invasion. And the U.S. wants to get something out of it. And about all they can get out of it at this point, Afghanistan's in terrible shape, I have to tell you, but is military bases. Is this good for the Afghans? Well, you tell me. I'm dubious. But whether it is or not, that's not the goal. If the U.S. wanted to help the Afghans, there would have been a way to do it. For example, after the Russians withdrew, they left the government, the Najibullah government, which actually was working pretty well. I mean, for example, women's rights were very well protected under the Russian and Najibullah governments. It wasn't a nice government like I don't like it. But by comparison with what the options were, it was one of the better governments, maybe the best. In fact, it's claimed, you can tell me, but it's now claimed that in, say, Kabul, what people look back, the leader that they, past leader they tend to have some respect for is Najibullah. Well, the government held out for a couple of years against the U.S. Pakistani-backed Mujahideen, and it did, in fact, continue to hold out. It was winning victories, it was establishing itself. And if the U.S. had cared about the Afghans, it would have supported it. Instead, it supported the Mujahideen, the Islamic, what we call Islamic terrorists now. They were our terrorists then. And when the Russians pulled out aid, the government fell. The Mujahideen attacked Kabul. They practically destroyed it. In fact, the atrocities were so extreme that when the Taliban came in, they were actually welcomed just to end the atrocities carried out by the U.S. back to the Mujahideen. Well, if there was any concern about the Afghans, it would have been the other way around. Here's a government that's kind of functioning, a lot of things wrong with it, doing some things right. Okay, we could help it. Instead, U.S. labored to destroy it and destroyed the country. Then comes the invasion. We're up till today. There's no interest.
No, I'm sorry. You need to be a
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have another talk. Then or now to help the Afghans. There are actually, to be precise, there are people in the field, like there are foreign service officers, and there are U.S. aid workers, and just like there were Russian aid workers, decent people who wanted to do something for the populations, but they're not the decision makers.
Thank you.
Got to take off. Yeah.
Mr. Chomsky, I would just like to extend our thanks for giving us some of your time. I know we've all taken very much from it, and we're looking forward to going over what we've learned in the future. So again, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Sorry, I got to rush off another talk, believe it or not.
This episode is brought to you by Think Global School. For more information, visit thinkglobalschool.org.